Greetings and welcome to Word Magazine. This is Jeff Riddle, pastor of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Louisa, Virginia. In this episode of Word Magazine, I'm going to be offering a draft of a book review that I have written. Recently, I've been doing a lot of things on text criticism. This is sort of a change of pace, and this is going to be a review of a memoir that I read by a man named Will Willimon, who's a noted minister in the United Methodist Church. I read and know very little about contemporary United Methodism, but some years back I read some things by Will Willimon, and he is a prolific writer. He's one of those kinds of people who sort of never has a thought that doesn't end up getting published. And I just thought it would be interesting to read this memoir. He's an engaging speaker. I've never met him personally or even heard him speak in person, but I've listened to some things from him online, and he's an engaging, humorous speaker. There are a lot of things, obviously, about him that I would not agree with, and I'm sure that some of my co-religionists who are conservative Reformed Protestants would even perhaps doubt his salvation, and certainly would doubt his credibility as a minister given his beliefs and stands. However, I do think that it is interesting to read the perspective of someone who holds very different and even completely antithetical views to your own. I remember some years back, we went to a fundraiser for the local pregnancy center, and the speaker was Cal Thomas. And he said that every day he read the New York Times and the Bible just so he could know what both sides were up to. And I felt a little bit like that in reading a memoir of a liberal Protestant minister, because that's not the position that I hold. And I think that in many ways, this memoir illustrates some of the problems with modern mainline Protestantism. And though on that score, it might be a bit of a warning for many contemporary evangelicals who are walking down some of those same paths. Willimon's always been a kind of an interesting case, because although he has embraced many aspects of liberal theology, he's a Bardian, and so he still wants to hold on to some of the traditional language and some of the traditional sort of ways of talking about the authority of the Bible. Of course, as I've pointed out in this podcast before, there are some major problems with Barth's views on Scripture. And so anyways, but Willimon has always been sort of maybe a conservative liberal, if I could use that term. So I, again, read this memoir. It's a really easy read. And I read it just in, I think, 2 days. And I sat down and just wrote up a quick review, and I got a draft of this. I sent it off to a journal. Hopefully it'll be in print. But I thought I would just share, again, this draft of my review. So here we go. I'm just going to kind of read it, and I might add a couple things along the way. We'll see. So the book, again, is Will Willimon, and the title is Accidental Preacher, subtitle A Memoir. It was published by Eerdmans in 2019, and the book is 242 pages in length. Here's the review. In a 1996 Baylor University survey, Will Willimon, born in 1946, was recognized as one of the 12 most effective preachers in the English language. Over the years, the South Carolina native has served as a local United Methodist Church pastor, as dean of the chapel and professor at Duke University, and as bishop of the North Alabama Conference of the United Methodist Church. A prolific preacher and writer known for his puckish and sometimes prickly wit, Willimon adds this engaging memoir to the stack of his over 80 published works, including 2 novels, perhaps the best known of which is the book Resident Aliens, written in 1989 and co-authored with his Duke colleague Stanley Hauerwas. The multi-talented Willimon even drew the simple sketches that illustrate this memoir. In the end, this work is a testimony to and reflection upon the author's call to the ministry, from one who embodies what may be a disappearing breed, the charming, sophisticated, avuncular, American, white male, liberal, mainline Protestant minister. Willimon offers the story of his life as if it were an extended illustration in one of his sermons. It keeps the reader's interest, makes ample use of the humorous as well as the serious, and in the end offers some profound theological reflections. Willimon begins by describing his youth in Greenville, South Carolina, raised by a single schoolteacher mother and a loving extended Southern family. He also candidly describes his estranged relationship with his charismatic but morally compromised father, who abandoned the family and eventually went to prison for financial fraud. Willimon reflects honestly on how these circumstances influenced the development of his uber-driven personality, moving from a merit badge procuring Eagle Scout to a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Wofford University, and even how it influenced his call to ministry and his course within it. A key point in that call was a serendipitous meeting as a college student with the liberal Baptist icon Carlyle Marney in, of all places, an art museum in Amsterdam. Marney told the impressionable young man, quote, "I've never known a preacher worth a damn who didn't have a bad mama or daddy problem," end quote, page 48. The ministry path took Willimon as a theology student to Yale Divinity School and to Emory University, as a local church pastor to Georgia and South Carolina, as a professor and chaplain to Duke University, and eventually as a Methodist bishop to North Alabama. There are plenty of engaging anecdotes shared along the way, from a Boy Scout road trip out west to having future Wheel of Fortune letter turner Vanna White in his Myrtle Beach church youth group, to an awkward dinner with megachurch pastor Robert Schuller, and more. Willimon shares plenty of his successes, but he is also generous in relaying a number of his failures, including getting rejected as a doctoral student at Duke, where he would eventually serve as a professor and chaplain, being passed over by the Presidential Search Committee at Wofford, his alma mater, and his sometimes painful tenure as a bishop. He writes on page 116, "Once we left Alabama Methodism, no one ever invited us back." Reflection on the call to ministry, again, is at the heart of this book. One section any pastor will find poignant is Willimon's description of a phone call he received informing him of his father's death, and how he then immediately had to leave to conduct his church's much-anticipated Christmas Eve service. He writes, quote, "Church does not wait for you to have the proper motivation for worship in order to call you to worship. And there are many times when you have been called to be a pastor that you don't feel like being a pastor, but still must act the part," end quote, page 71. Willimon makes clear that by calling himself an accidental preacher, he does not mean that his calling was random or purposeless. Rather, as he puts it on page 105, what seems to be an accident is, through the eyes of faith, providence. In the very beginning of the book, even before the introduction or the prelude, he has a little entry where the word accidental is written in bold, sort of like a dictionary entry, and there's a pronunciation guide for it, and then it describes it as being an adjective, and then it's defined as unwitting, fortuitous, inadvertent, unexpected, unplanned, adventitious, serendipitous, unanticipated, unforeseen, also unlooked for, unpremeditated, fluky. And so that's what he means by the term accidental. Willimon teems with contradictions. He is a Wesleyan and a Bartian, a liberal mainline Protestant who mocks political correctness, and a sometimes caustic critic of Methodism who cherishes his divided denomination. Willimon would, no doubt, affirm the most basic tenets of Christian orthodoxy, like the Trinity. But, as with many of his mainline peers, he takes a far less traditional approach to contemporary political and social issues. For Willimon, there is no nuance in the history of the civil rights controversies of the 60s, and he is quick to pile on to his fellow Southerners. Trump, in his view, is a charlatan. The only Christian position must be full and uncritical acceptance of immigration, etc. He is perhaps politician enough to steer clear of sustained engagement with issues that he knows have little biblical support. The subject of homosexual practice and gay marriage, for example, is currently rending his denomination in two. He offers only a handful of sentences on the subject near the end of the memoir, reflecting understated approval of gay marriage based on what seems to this reviewer to be convoluted thinking. He writes, quote, "Same-sex marriage, ? Being in the fidelity-promoting, promise-keeping, forgiveness-receiving business, the church, you'd think, would be eager to find one more occasion to make people make promises, welcoming anyone who dared to put his or her life at the mercy of the future with another human being. Go figure." End quote, page 192. My guess is he does not want to offend the progressive wing of his church, but also recognizes the rather obvious problems that this view presents with respect to plain sense biblical fidelity. Accepting and promoting so-called same-sex marriage in our times hardly means that one is acting as a resident alien, but it more likely indicates he has wholeheartedly embraced the values of what Paul called in Galatians 1:4, this present evil world. I noted above that men like Willimon may be a disappearing breed, as mainline Protestant denominations continue to divide, dwindle, and dissipate. I certainly have profound disagreements with Willimon on essential matters of faith and practice. Nevertheless, I enjoyed and gained from reading this memoir, and would suggest that it might hold value for others contemplating their own vocational calling to the ministry and the providential accidents of God revealed in the well-told story of another's life. This brings this review to an end, and with that, it also brings this episode of Word Magazine to an end. I hope that some of this content will prove helpful and edifying to those who listen, and I will look forward to speaking to you in the next Word Magazine. Till then, take care and God bless.